Stop for a moment. Don't swipe away from this. Don't tell yourself you'll come back later. And don't assume you already know what this message is about, because there is something very strange about the moment you are in right now. You could have been anywhere. You could have watched something else. You could have closed this video before hearing the first sentence, but somehow you are here. And before we go any further, I want you to ask yourself one question. Why this message? Why today? Why now? Maybe you don't have an answer yet. That's okay. You don't need one yet. Because sometimes the meaning of a moment doesn't become clear until you have lived through the entire moment. And if you've been feeling lately like something inside you is changing, even though you can't explain exactly what it is, I want you to listen very carefully. Because this message is about waiting, but not the kind of waiting you think. It's about the kind of waiting that happens when everything around you becomes quiet. When the people you thought would stay begin disappearing. When opportunities you thought were certain suddenly collapse. When plans you spent months building fall apart in a matter of days. When you pray for an answer, and instead of receiving one, you receive silence. And perhaps the hardest part isn't the silence itself. The hardest part is wondering whether anyone is listening. There may have been nights when you didn't say anything to anyone. You simply lay there with your thoughts. You replayed conversations. You remembered people. You thought about decisions you made. You wondered whether you should have chosen differently. You wondered whether you missed something. You wondered whether your life was supposed to look different by now. And maybe, at some point, you quietly asked a question you didn't want anyone else to hear. Why am I still waiting? If you've ever asked that question, then stay with me, because there is another question hiding behind it. What if the waiting was not proof that you had been forgotten? What if the waiting was revealing something you could not have seen while everything was moving? Think about that. When life is moving quickly, you don't always notice what is happening underneath the surface. You don't notice who is genuine. You don't notice which relationships are draining you. You don't notice how much of your identity depends on other people's approval. You don't notice how desperately you are holding on to something simply because you're afraid of what will happen when you let it go. But when everything becomes quiet, you start seeing, and sometimes what you see hurts. You realize that the person you were fighting to keep was never fighting equally for you. You realize that the opportunity you thought you needed was actually keeping you trapped. You realize that the place you were begging to belong was slowly destroying your confidence. You realize that some people only loved the version of you that was easy to control, and suddenly, the closed door begins to look different. At first you called it rejection, then you called it failure, then you called it bad luck. But eventually you may begin to wonder, what if that door closing saved me from something I couldn't see? Don't rush past that question. Stay there for a second, because that question can change the way you remember your entire past. There are things you once cried over that you may one day thank God for removing. There are people you once begged to stay who you may eventually be grateful walked away. There are opportunities you thought were your breakthrough that may have been nothing more than a distraction wearing the clothes of a blessing. And there are moments that felt like the end of your story, that were actually the end of a version of your story. Maybe you weren't being buried. Maybe something in you was being rebuilt. And this is where the image of Archangel Michael becomes powerful within the spiritual message we're exploring. Michael has traditionally been associated with courage, protection, strength, and standing against what threatens you. So when you hear that Michael has been waiting, don't only imagine someone standing in the clouds watching a clock. Think deeper. Think about protection. Think about preparation. Think about the moment when you finally become strong enough to recognize what should never enter your life again. Because sometimes the greatest protection doesn't look like receiving something. Sometimes it looks like losing something. Sometimes protection sounds like a door closing. Sometimes protection feels like loneliness. Sometimes protection is the sudden loss of interest in something you once couldn't live without. Sometimes protection is the uncomfortable feeling that tells you, I can't keep doing this. And perhaps you've felt that lately. Maybe you've noticed that certain conversations don't interest you anymore. Maybe you don't want to explain yourself to everyone anymore. Maybe you're tired of proving your worth. Maybe you no longer want to chase people. Maybe you are becoming protective of your peace. And perhaps someone around you has even said, you've changed. Yes, maybe you have. But not every change is a loss. Sometimes change is evidence that you finally learned something your pain was trying to teach you. There was a version of you that tolerated things because you were afraid of being alone. There was a version of you that said yes when everything inside you was screaming no. There was a version of you that confused being needed with being loved. There was a version of you that believed losing someone meant losing yourself, but something happened. You went through the fire, you survived the silence, you experienced the disappointment, and now you're beginning to understand something. You can miss someone and still know they shouldn't come back. You can love someone and still choose distance. You can forgive someone and still refuse to give them access to your life. You can remember the past without returning to it. That's growth. And growth doesn't always feel beautiful while it's happening. Sometimes growth feels like grief. Sometimes it feels like confusion. Sometimes it feels like standing in the middle of your life and saying, I don't recognize myself anymore. But maybe that's because you're not supposed to become the old you again. Maybe the person you're becoming is unfamiliar because you've never been this version of yourself before. And here's where I want you to be honest with yourself. What have you been trying to force? What relationship have you been trying to save? What situation have you been trying to make work? What door have you been knocking on over and over even though nothing on the other side is opened? And why? Is it because that door truly belongs to you? Or is it because you're afraid that if you stop knocking, you'll have to admit it was never yours? That's a painful question, but sometimes the question that hurts the most is the question that finally frees you. Maybe you've been waiting for someone to apologize. Maybe you've been waiting for someone to recognize your value. Maybe you've been waiting for someone to come back. Maybe you've been waiting for a financial breakthrough. Maybe you've been waiting for your family to understand you. Maybe you've been waiting for life to finally become fair. But what if your next chapter cannot begin until you stop making your future dependent on something from your past? What if the thing you're waiting for isn't coming in the form you imagined? What if your answer arrives differently? What if instead of getting that person back, you get your peace back? What if instead of returning to that old opportunity, you discover a better one? What if instead of receiving an apology, you finally stop needing one? What if instead of being chosen by the person you wanted, you finally choose yourself? That is the kind of transformation nobody can see from the outside. And perhaps that is why your season has felt so strange. Because the external world may not have changed yet, but something inside you already has. You may not have noticed it. But think about it. Things that used to destroy you don't have the same power anymore. People who used to control your emotions can't reach you in the same way. You don't react as quickly. You don't explain as much. You don't chase as much. You don't need everyone to understand your decisions. And maybe you're quieter now, not because you have nothing to say, but because you finally understand that not everyone deserves an explanation. That is a different kind of strength. And if you're recognizing yourself in what I'm saying, don't feel pressured to write a long comment. Just write, I'm ready. Not because those two words are magic, but because sometimes you need to hear yourself declare that you're ready to stop living backward. I'm ready. Ready to release what no longer belongs. Ready to stop chasing what keeps running away. Ready to stop begging for what should have been freely given. Ready to stop confusing delay with failure. Ready to stop allowing one painful chapter to define the entire story. Because here's something you need to understand. You are not late. You are not automatically behind because someone else reached a destination before you. You are not disqualified because your life took longer than you expected. You are not forgotten because your answer didn't arrive when you demanded it. Sometimes timing is painful because we want certainty before we're ready for responsibility. We want the blessing before we've developed the wisdom to carry it. We want the relationship before we've learned the boundaries necessary to protect it. We want the opportunity before we've developed the discipline necessary to sustain it. We want the next chapter while still emotionally living inside the previous one. And life has a strange way of exposing that contradiction. You say you want something new, but you're still holding on to the old. You say you want peace, but you're still entertaining chaos. You say you want healthy relationships, but you're still making excuses for people who repeatedly hurt you. You say you want purpose, but you're spending every day trying to impress people who don't even understand your journey. At some point, something has to change, and perhaps that change has already begun. Maybe that's why this message feels personal, not because someone is promising you that tomorrow morning everything will magically become perfect. No, life doesn't work that way. But because you're beginning to recognize that you have more control over your next decision than you ever had over your past. You can't change who betrayed you. You can't rewrite the conversation. You can't erase the years. You can't force someone to understand what they did. But you can decide what happens next. You can decide what gets access to you. You can decide what you tolerate. You can decide what you carry. You can decide what you release. And sometimes one decision becomes the first brick in an entirely different future. That's why the message isn't asking you to panic. It is asking you to pay attention. There is a difference between urgency and fear. Fear says, something terrible is about to happen. Wisdom says, something important deserves your attention. So don't listen to this message with fear. Listen with awareness. Ask yourself what your life has been trying to tell you. What pattern keeps repeating? What lesson keeps returning? What type of person keeps entering your life? What situation keeps producing the same pain? What are you refusing to acknowledge because accepting it would require you to change? Those questions matter, because sometimes we're waiting for a sign when we've already received the lesson. We're waiting for a miracle when the next step is simply obedience to what we already know. We're asking for clarity while deliberately ignoring the truth that makes us uncomfortable. And perhaps that's what makes this moment different. You already know something. Maybe you don't know everything, but you know something. You know which relationship has been draining you. You know which habit has been stealing your time. You know which fear has been keeping you small. You know which dream you've been postponing. You know which conversation you've been avoiding. You know which version of yourself you're tired of pretending to be. And maybe you've known for longer than you want to admit. That's why the waiting became so uncomfortable. Because once you know, you can't unknow. You can delay. You can distract yourself. You can pretend. But deep inside, the truth remains. And perhaps your season of waiting has been teaching you how to recognize that truth without running from it. Now there's something else you need to hear. You may have spent so much time wondering why certain people left, that you never asked who you became after they left. You may have spent so much time grieving what disappeared, that you never noticed what appeared inside you. Strength, discernment, patience, self-respect, courage, a deeper understanding of your own boundaries, a quieter confidence, and perhaps even faith that doesn't need constant evidence. That's important, because immature faith says, I will believe when I see. Mature faith says, I can keep moving even while I don't know everything. That doesn't mean believing every prediction or ignoring reality. It means refusing to allow uncertainty to paralyze you. And that may be the real battle you're facing now. Not an enemy outside you, not some invisible force you need to fear, but the battle between the person you have been and the person you know you could become. One voice says, stay where it's familiar. Another says, grow. One says, go back. Another says, keep moving. One says, you already know how this story ends. Another says, you have never lived this chapter before. And which voice will you listen to? That choice belongs to you. No angel can make it for you. No message can make it for you. No video can make it for you. You have to decide. And maybe that's why you are here. Not to be given a magical shortcut, but to be reminded that you still have a choice. You still have a future. You still have the ability to change direction. You still have time to become someone your past self could never have imagined. And if you've been feeling like your life has been frozen, look again. Maybe it wasn't frozen. Maybe it was rearranging. Maybe certain things had to leave because they were occupying space. Maybe certain plans had to fail because they were built around a version of you that no longer exists. Maybe certain people had to disappear because you were never going to discover your own strength while constantly depending on theirs. Maybe the silence wasn't empty. Maybe it was making room. And that's when the idea of Michael waiting becomes much more meaningful. Not because you should imagine a supernatural countdown, but because the message of protection and courage is arriving at a moment when you are beginning to understand what you need to protect. Your peace, your purpose, your attention, your time, your heart, your future. Not everyone deserves access to those things, and you don't need to feel guilty for understanding that. There is a point in life when kindness without boundaries becomes self-destruction. You can be compassionate and still be discerning. You can have faith and still use wisdom. You can forgive and still walk away. You can love people without allowing them to determine your identity. And perhaps the greatest thing you can do now is stop asking, who will choose me? And start asking, who and what am I choosing? That question changes everything. Because when you stop waiting for someone else to validate your worth, you become harder to manipulate. When you stop needing everyone to understand you, you become freer. When you stop chasing every opportunity, you become more selective. When you stop being terrified of losing people, You begin recognizing which relationships are actually healthy. And when you stop treating every closed door like a personal rejection, you begin looking around for the door you were supposed to notice all along. Maybe that's where your story is going. Not backward, forward. But there is still one thing we haven't uncovered. Why did this particular season have to last so long? Why did you have to wait through the silence? Why did the answer seem so delayed? Why did you have to become tired before you became clear? Why did you have to lose your certainty before discovering your discernment? And perhaps the answer is uncomfortable, because sometimes we don't change when we're comfortable. We change when the old way of living becomes impossible to continue. You can ignore a lesson when the consequences are small, but when the same lesson repeats, eventually you have to pay attention. Maybe that is what happened. The same pattern, different person, same disappointment, different situation, same emotional wound, different chapter, until one day, you finally said, enough. Not with anger, not with revenge, just enough. Enough of abandoning yourself, enough of chasing, enough of pretending, enough of shrinking, enough of accepting crumbs and calling them blessings, enough of waiting for someone to become the person you needed them to be, enough of living for approval, enough of allowing your past to negotiate your future. And perhaps that was the moment the waiting began to end, not because the world suddenly changed, because you did. That's the part people don't understand about transformation. They expect the breakthrough to arrive first. But sometimes the internal decision comes first. Then the external circumstances begin catching up. You decide you're done. You change your behavior. You stop returning. You stop chasing. You stop entertaining. You start building. You start learning. You start protecting your attention. And slowly, your life begins to look different. Not overnight, not magically, but meaningfully. And maybe you're closer to that point than you realize. So if you've been wondering why you feel different lately, don't immediately assume something is wrong. Ask whether something inside you is finally becoming clear. If you've been feeling less attached to the past, pay attention. If you've been craving peace more than attention, pay attention. If you've suddenly become more selective about who gets access to you, pay attention. If certain things that once seemed attractive now feel empty, pay attention. Sometimes the first sign of a new chapter isn't excitement. Sometimes it's the loss of desire for the old chapter, and that can feel strangely quiet, almost like grief. But don't confuse the quiet with emptiness. A field looks empty before something grows. A page looks empty before a story is written. A room looks empty before it is filled. And perhaps your life is in that strange space right now, not empty, preparing. So breathe. You don't have to solve everything today. You don't need to know exactly how your next year will unfold. You don't need every answer before taking the next healthy step. You only need enough clarity for the next decision. And perhaps that decision is very simple. Release what you already know you have outgrown. Protect what you know is valuable. Stop chasing what repeatedly chooses not to stay. And make room for what aligns with the person you're becoming. Because if you continue carrying everything from your past into your future, you will eventually discover that even a beautiful new opportunity feels heavy because you're carrying an old life into it. You can't carry every person, every regret, every betrayal, every unanswered question, every missed opportunity, every version of yourself. Some things must remain where they happened. The past can teach you. It doesn't have to travel with you. And maybe that's the message you needed today. Not that something supernatural is going to happen at a specific hour. Not that you should be afraid of missing a mystical deadline, but that you have reached a moment where you need to stop sleeping through your own life. Look around. Look within. Notice what is changing. Notice what you're tolerating. Notice what you're avoiding. Notice what gives you peace. Notice what repeatedly takes it away. And then ask yourself one final question before we continue deeper into this message. If you truly believe that your future could be different, what would you stop doing today? Would you stop chasing? Would you stop doubting yourself? Would you stop returning to the same painful situation? Would you stop waiting for someone else's permission? Would you finally begin the thing you've been postponing? Would you finally forgive yourself? Would you finally accept that some doors are closed? Would you finally turn around and walk towards something new? Think about that, because perhaps the most important message isn't waiting somewhere in the future. Perhaps it is already sitting inside the decision you are about to make. And if your heart is telling you that something has to change, don't ignore it. Move carefully, move wisely, move with faith, but move, because you have already spent enough time standing at the door that closed. You don't need to spend the rest of your life waiting for it to reopen. There may be another door, There may be another path. There may be another version of your life that you haven't even imagined yet. And perhaps the reason you had to wait so long was not because nothing was happening. It was because you were becoming someone capable of walking through what comes next. So if you made it this far, take a second and breathe. And if something in this message touched a part of your story that you haven't talked about with anyone, you don't have to explain it. Just write, "I'm still here." Because sometimes that's the most honest testimony there is. I'm still here, after everything, after the waiting, after the disappointment, after the doors that closed, after the people who left, after the nights I thought I couldn't continue. I'm still here, and maybe that's where the next part of your story begins. Not with everything suddenly becoming easy, but with you finally realizing the waiting did not erase you. It strengthened your awareness. It changed your priorities. It taught you what to protect. It taught you what to release. It taught you that not every loss is a punishment. And perhaps most importantly, it taught you that you can survive a chapter you once believed would destroy you. Now ask yourself, if you survive that, what makes you think you cannot handle what comes next? Stay with this message, because we haven't reached the deepest part yet. We've only started understanding why the waiting happened. The next question is much more personal. What was happening behind the scenes of your life while you thought nothing was happening? Why did certain people disappear at exactly the moment they did? Why did certain opportunities fail? Why did your loneliness become so intense? Why did you suddenly begin seeing people differently? And why, after everything you've lost, do you feel as if something inside you is quietly telling you, your story isn't over? Maybe that voice deserves your attention. Maybe the waiting is finally teaching you how to listen. And maybe you are closer to your next chapter than you think.